The larger your company is, the more likely you benefit when it comes to how quickly you can go to market, how few regulatory hurdles stand in your way, and how much you can communicate with investors. Today on Zippy Point. I'm Brock Romanek, and I'm a big fan of yous. When it comes to accessing the markets, the SEC has drawn up 4 categories of companies to determine how much information and how they go about accessing the markets. The first one is known as the WKSI. This top-tier category is the well-known seasoned issuer known as a WKSI, the acronym. This category of issuer has the greatest flexibility in conducting securities offerings on the theory that a large established issuer already is known to the market and shouldn't have to jump through a lot of regulatory hoops to get to the market. It's defined in Rule 405 of Regulation C. That's the definition of terms under the 33 Act. And there you can see that WKSIs are able to access the markets with few restrictions. They have a lot of flexibility with their shelf registrations and can pretty easily communicate with investors. They can specifically do these 5 things. 1, they file automatic shelf registration statements, which become effective immediately upon filing with the SEC. 2, they can omit more information from the base prospectus than permitted for the other types of issuers, the other shelf registration statements that those issuers use, including omitting a description of the securities other than identifying a type of class. The plan of distribution can be omitted, whether the offering is a primary or secondary offering, and the identity of selling shareholders. You don't need to do any of that. You can register unspecified, unlimited amounts of securities and do so without allocating among securities or between primary and secondary offerings. And a big benefit is paying the filing fees on a pay-as-you-go basis at the time of each takedown from the shelf, rather than when the registration statement is filed. That's kind of like Zippy Point's pay what you can business model. So you could, if you're a WKSI, you can make offers before a registration statement is on file without violating the gun jumping restrictions under the federal securities laws. So these are all some really good benefits, and WKSIs don't want to lose their status as a WKSI. That's why obtaining a waiver from the CorpFin staff to remain a WKSI is such an important and delicate endeavor. See my separate Vid-Guide about the process of how you go about seeking a waiver from the staff. The CorpFin has set up a very specific process about how you go about accomplishing that. So from the definition of WKSI under Rule 405, here's the rundown of how you qualify as a WKSI, what the thresholds are. And here's how you ascertain what date you make the determination. It's literally known as the determination date. 2 and 3, large accelerated filer and accelerated filer. So it's defined in Rule 12b-2. Large accelerated filer and accelerated filers are the next 2 tiers of filers, each with their own thresholds, their own limitations on what they can and can't do when it comes to filing their shelves and communicate with investors about their potential offerings. In early 2020, the SEC adopted new thresholds for these 2 types of filers. The SEC tends to make adjustments in those thresholds every so often. And here's that adopting release. And then see this chart from the SCED memo about what those thresholds currently are for accelerated and large accelerated filers. Number 4, the non-accelerated filer. Although Rule 12b-2 defined accelerated filer and large accelerated filer, it doesn't define the term non-accelerated filer. If an issuer doesn't meet the definition of accelerated or large accelerated filer, it's a non-accelerated filer. So I should spend a moment in distinguishing non-accelerated filer from a smaller reporting company. That term, the smaller reporting company, is defined in Rule 12b-2 also. Being deemed a non-accelerated filer means that you have the most work to do regulatory-wise, at least, to get to the market. Being deemed a smaller reporting company allows you to take advantage of all sorts of regulatory relief from what you report on a regular basis, what you report in your 10Ks and your 10Qs and so on. So you get more time to actually file your 10Ks and 10Qs compared to the other types of filer, which is nice, even though you're disclosing less. So this is all part of the SEC's efforts to allow scaled back disclosure and provide other accommodations to reduce the burdens on smaller companies and entice them to go public and not remain a private company. Under the SEC's 2020 rulemaking, some but not all small reporting companies are non-accelerated filers, so it's a little bit of a Venn diagram. So the non-accelerated filer classification is a regulatory to determine how easily you can get to market, And the smaller reporting company classification is to determine how much and when you have ongoing disclosure obligations. So here's another chart from that SCAD memo that illustrates the relationships between small reporting companies and non-accelerated, accelerated, and large accelerated filers. And then here's one last SCAD chart about how you kick the tires on an ongoing basis to determine what type of filer you are, something that we're about to discuss in detail in a moment with our guests. Most of that guidance emanates out of Rule 12B2.3. Our guest today, Joe Alley, is going to bring us home on this topic. He's a partner and chair of the Securities and Corporate Governance practice for Arnall, Gold & Gregory down in Atlanta. I'm Brock Romanek, today on Zippy Point.
Quick Zips by Zippy Point.
Quick and dirty. So Joe, as you know, I promised the audience that we'd hear a little bit about how, if you're an issuer, how you do the annual checkup to see if you should change your status for the next year. How do you go about doing that?
So the determination of whether or not an issuer is an accelerated filer or a large accelerated filer, it technically takes place at the end of the year. But one of the most important prongs of that definition, both definitions, has to do with public float. And that determination is made as of the last business day of the issuer's most recently completed fiscal quarter. So it gets to be a little bit confusing. You determine at the end of the year whether you're an accelerated filer or a large accelerated filer, but you look back for this particular prong, you look back to the end of that most recent second fiscal quarter. So public float is the determination, and that's a shorthand term for the aggregate worldwide market value of the voting and non-voting common equity held by the issuer's non-affiliates as of the last business day of that second fiscal quarter. So how do you calculate public float? Well, first you determine who the issuer's affiliates are. SEC rules define an affiliate as a person that is controlled by, or is under common control with the issuer. And control is defined as having the power directly or indirectly to direct or cause direction of the management and policies of the issuer. So it's basically come to be expected that all directors and executive officers are affiliates, as well as their family members and other related entities whose share ownership is attributed to them. And then usually large shareholders as well. So typically 10% and greater shareholders are considered affiliates. You might even go with a lesser percentage, depending upon the distribution of shares and whether or not a lower percentage actually gives you the power to sort of direct management of the issuer. You also need to look at other persons that maybe through contractual or other rights or relationships might be able to influence management. Most issuers probably already know who their affiliates are because for purposes of trading securities and whether or not they're required to file a Form 144, and you've probably already figured that out. So basically you take all those affiliates, you subtract the shares that they own from total outstanding shares, and this is just shares that are actually outstanding. So you don't include any derivative securities like options or restricted stock units, and you definitely don't include treasury shares. So once you subtracted all the shares held by affiliates, you multiply what's left by your last sale price or the average of the last bid and ask prices as of the end of that second quarter. So even though public float is determined as of the end of the second quarter, all the other provisions for accelerated and large accelerated filers are determined at the end of the year. So that's whether or not you've been subject to 34 Act reporting for at least 12 calendar months, whether you filed at least one annual report, and whether or not you're eligible to be a smaller reporting company under the revenue tests. So if you are eligible under the smaller reporting company revenue tests to be a smaller reporting company, then you are not an accelerated filer or a large accelerated filer. So even though you're looking at public float at the end of the year, even if you fail that test, at the end of the second fiscal quarter, even if you fail that test at the end of the year, if you satisfy the smaller reporting company requirement because of the revenue test, then you will not be an accelerated filer or a large accelerated filer, regardless of your public float at the end of your second fiscal quarter.
Yeah, I remember being in law school, or maybe it was even early on in my career, but just when you're a young lawyer and you're hearing affiliate and control persons, those always were concepts that took a while to try to learn and then to put them into practice, particularly if you're dealing with a smaller or mid-market company where the facts can get a little bit complicated sometimes. It can be a challenge, but it depends on your circumstances.
That's right. That's right. And, usually no one focuses on it at that time, at the end of the second fiscal quarter. It usually comes up when you're filing the 10K. You realize, oh yeah, I've got to look back and figure that out.
So I know you've seen my little intro video. Did you have any things that you wanted to add or correct?
Nothing to correct. There are a few things. I mean, the 10K requires that you identify whether you're an accelerated filer, a large accelerated filer, a non-accelerated filer, a smaller reporting company, an emerging growth company, or a well-known seasoned issuer, or WKSI. There's overlap between a lot of those categories, and it is very confusing. So I thought maybe I would just sort of briefly talk about how these categories interact. So if you're a reporting company and you're filing a 10K and you have to check the boxes. So first, as of what date do you make each determination? So for accelerated, large accelerated, and non-accelerated filers, the determination date is the end of the fiscal year, but one of the prongs is the determination of public float, and that's made as of the last business day of the prior second fiscal quarter. For smaller reporting companies, the actual determination date is the last business day of the second fiscal quarter. And for emerging growth companies, there is no specified determination date. For the revenue test, you look at revenues for the most recently completed fiscal year. For the debt test, it's whenever that $1 billion in non-convertible debt issued over 3 years, it's just whatever date you reach that point. For WKSIs, you pick a date within 60 days of filing the Form 10K to make your determination. So how do these different categories overlap? Accelerated filer, large accelerated filer, and non-accelerated filer are mutually exclusive. So you can never be more than one of those. So you only check one of those boxes. Smaller reporting companies can overlap with emerging growth companies, accelerated filers, and non-accelerated filers, but not with large accelerated filers. So you can never be a large accelerated filer and a smaller reporting company. And although it's theoretically possible for a smaller reporting company to briefly also be a WKSI, it's very unlikely to happen. So emerging growth companies can overlap with smaller reporting companies, accelerated filers, and WKSIs, but not, again, with large accelerated filers, same as a smaller reporting company. So large accelerated filers do not overlap with emerging growth companies and smaller reporting companies. So how do you change your status? What happens when you change your status? Accelerated, large accelerated, and non-accelerated filer status, again, is determined at the end of the year, but it has a hurdle that's 80% below the initial hurdle. So although you have a public float of over 75 million, you need to have to be an accelerated filer, you have to have a public float below 60 million to cease being an accelerated filer. Similarly, transitioning from large accelerated filer to accelerated filer, you've got another 80% lower hurdle before you move down to the next rung. Once you change your status as an accelerated filer or a large accelerated filer, it takes effect with the 10K for the next year. For smaller reporting companies, the determination happens at the end of the second fiscal quarter, and it takes effect for the first 10Q of the following fiscal year. So you continue to be a smaller reporting company through the 10K for that year, even if your status changes at the end of that second fiscal quarter. However, if you haven't been a smaller reporting company and you qualify at the end of that second fiscal quarter, you can voluntarily choose to apply it earlier, beginning as early as the 10Q for that second quarter. For WKSIs, your status is good until your next determination date, and that is likely going to be either the next time you file or amend Form S3, or when you file your Form 10K to incorporate it by reference into a Form S3. For emerging growth companies, it's an ongoing test, and as soon as you fail it, you lose your EGC or emerging growth company status. Okay.
Yeah, you make it seem so easy to understand. And the SEC does tinker with the thresholds. You know, in 2020, they did it again. So it's sort of a moving target over time.
Yes. And that 2020 chart that they have in the smaller reporting company definition, if anyone is able to first time read that and understand what that says, then kudos to them, because it took me a while to figure it out. I would go read the descriptions of it in the adopting release and still not quite get it. It took a couple of times.
So once you're a WKSI, you're definitely don't want to lose that status. And so there is a waiver process that's been around for quite a while now. Can you describe a little bit what that's like? And that's with the SEC staff. They have to grant a waiver of something that would otherwise disqualify you from being a WKSI anymore.
That's right. So there are several prongs you have to satisfy to qualify as a WKSI, but one of them is that you not be an ineligible issuer. The term ineligible issuer is defined in Rule 405, and there are a litany of things that can make you one, but most notably, it includes issuers that are subject to some specified bad boy provisions. And it includes being convicted of some felonies or misdemeanors, or having violated the anti-fraud provisions, or being subject to an order or decree regarding the anti-fraud provisions. But under Rule 405, in that definition, the Commission is allowed to grant waivers of ineligible issuer status if there's been a good showing that it's not necessary for an issuer to be considered ineligible. So that's the WKSI waiver. And the Commission has delegated authority to act on waiver applications from ineligible issuer status to the Director of the Division of Corporation Finance. And in 2014, the Division of Corporation Finance issued a statement that sort of updated and refined its policy on what it takes to get one of those waivers. And per that statement, the focus is going to be on the reliability of the issuer's current and future disclosure, and whether or not the conduct that resulted in the ineligible status impacts that reliability. And then they'll also focus on what steps the issuer has taken to remediate any deficiencies. The burden is on the issuer to demonstrate that the conduct that gave rise to that status is not going to impact its current and future disclosure and the reliability of that disclosure. And if there's been a criminal or a cyanar-based violation, then the issuer's burden is going to be significantly greater. And the Division of Corporation Finance basically laid out three categories that should be addressed when you're applying for this waiver. First, who's responsible for and what was the duration of the misconduct? Specifically, if senior personnel were involved or aware, or if there were red flags that they should have noticed. And then what was the duration? Was it over a number of years, or was it just an isolated instance? So if you've got bad conduct that was an isolated instance and not known or disregarded by senior personnel, then it'd be more likely that this factor would weigh in favor of granting a waiver. The next factor is what remedial steps were taken. So they're going to look at whether or not there were key changes to the personnel involved, and also whether or not there were steps or training taken to improve internal controls and disclosure controls and procedures. So the focus would be to look for actions that would support a conclusion that despite the past violations, the issuer's disclosure going forward is going to be more reliable than it was in the past. And then the third factor is the impact if the waiver request is denied. So the staff generally does not entertain or grant a waiver based solely on a hypothetical benefit or impact. So the issuer will need to show exactly what negative things will occur if they're not granted the waiver. So issuers that are seeking a waiver are required to submit a request letter that includes the justification based on the factors that I just laid out. And inquiries regarding WKSI waivers are generally directed to the division's Office of Enforcement Liaison. Now, prior to 2019, issuers were not allowed to condition settlements with the SEC on receiving a WKSI or any other waiver. So the waiver request was considered separately by the Commission, but that changed in 2019, and now the Commission will consider them both together in order that issuers can have certainty about the impact of their settlements. So WKSI waivers can be granted by either the Commission or the Division of Corporation Finance. but typically the two work in tandem. And so you don't see a lot of separate waivers issued by the Division of Corporation Finance, at least not recently. So negotiating the waiver and preparing the waiver request should now be an integral part of all settlement negotiations. And that's pretty much it.
So before you would see these waivers, the orders come out, and then now you're saying it's just integrated right into the settlement.
That's right. That's right. And even though the request is typically done to the Division of Corporation Finance, you will see the actual letters come out from them as, by order of the commission. It looks like they actually speak with the commission and make sure the commission is okay with what they're doing. Although they do technically have the authority.
And I think it was about 10 years ago that the bad boy term was coined. Now I'm pretty sure it would be bad girl and bad boy.
Yeah, that's right. Boy. It's kind of sexist.
Definitely. A little bit. Well, thanks so much for your time, Joe. This is
Hey, thank you. Thank you. Enjoyed it. So what's your time?